Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the mountains of western Maine in early March. The ski trails of Sugarloaf Mountain still carry their wide white ribbons of packed snow through the trees, and the air above Carabasset Valley is thin and cold, pierced in the day by the distant sounds of ski lifts and laughter, and quieted at night to something absolute. The stars come out early over that valley. The condominiums and lodge buildings cluster near the base of the mountain, lit warmly from inside, full of people who have come from somewhere else to work the winter season. It is, by every external measure, an idyllic place to spend the cold months. The kind of place young people come for the mountains, for the shared adventure of seasonal life, for the feeling that ordinary time has been suspended and something freer and more vivid has taken its place. That was why Michaela Rose DeSantis was there. She was 23 years old, from Colchester, Connecticut, a quiet town in the northeastern corner of the state, the kind of modest New England community where people grow up knowing their neighbors and where family means showing up. Michaela had grown up in the full warmth of that kind of life. Her younger sister Max described her in the raw, honest way that only a sibling can, as the best big sister, the greatest role model, the most heartfelt and well-minded woman she had ever been around. Michaela loved to bake for the people she cared about. She painted. She did crafts in her spare time with the kind of easy creativity that some people have in their hands, a talent for making things, for giving them shape and color and meaning. She went to work every day and genuinely enjoyed it. She loved people, and people felt it when they were around her. She had also loved the mountains. Sugarloaf, Maine's largest ski resort, rising to over 4,000 feet at the summit of Sugarloaf Mountain in Franklin County, draws seasonal workers from across New England and beyond. Young people who trade the routines of ordinary life for the rhythm of ski season, trading their regular towns for shared condo buildings and resort shifts, and the particular camaraderie of people living temporarily close together in a cold and beautiful place. Michaela had come for the season, and she had not come alone. She came with Austin Doucette. He was 24 years old, from Carabasset Valley itself, one of the few year-round residents among the seasonal staff, and he and Michaela had been together for 7 years, nearly 8. 7 years is not the length of a casual relationship. 7 years is the length of a life built alongside someone, of shared history and shared language, and the kind of deep familiarity that makes two people feel, to the outside world, inseparable. They had grown from teenagers into adults together. They had come through all the changes that the years between 16 and 23 contain, and they had arrived at Sugarloaf together, working together at the resort, living together in a condo unit at the Left Bank complex, close to the mountain, and close to each other in the way that people who have been a couple for nearly a decade naturally are. 2 months from now, Michaela would have turned 24. Spring was coming. The mountains had already given most of what they had to give this season. There were things ahead. Sunday evening arrived over Carabasset Valley on March 8th, 2026, in the ordinary way that Sunday evenings arrive, with the gradual darkening of the sky over the mountain and the sound of the valley settling into night. It was not yet 8 o'clock. The condo buildings along Left Bank were lit against the dark, and inside the unit that Michaela and Austin shared, a residence provided to them by Sugarloaf as part of the resort's employee housing arrangement. Something happened that would alter the lives of everyone who loved either of them, and end the life of one of them entirely. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, the Franklin County Regional Communications Center received a 911 call. The caller was Austin Doucette. He was on the phone, breathing hard, and he was telling the dispatcher that his girlfriend had been shot. He said that the gun had gone off accidentally. He said he could not believe what had happened. He said it over and over in the way that people say things when shock has caught them off balance, repeating the same phrase because the repetition is the only way the mind can attempt to process something it cannot accept. And at some point during those calls, in a moment that would later be documented in court records and reported by news outlets across Maine and New England, Austin Doucette said something to the woman lying on the floor of their condo. In the voice of someone addressing a person he had loved for the better part of a decade, he said 3 words. "I'm sorry, babe." Michaela had been shot twice. Both wounds were to her chest. The medical examiner's autopsy, conducted in the hours and days that followed, would confirm the precise location and nature of those wounds. 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, not one, not a glancing wound, but 2 shots, placed in the center of the body, where the vital organs that sustain a person's life sit closest to the surface. When first responders from the Carabasset Valley Police Department arrived at the Left Bank condo complex, they found Michaela DeSantis alive. She was transported immediately to Maine Health Franklin Hospital in Farmington, the nearest medical facility, approximately 25 miles from the valley, a drive that in normal conditions takes half an hour and in emergency conditions feels like far longer. From Farmington, given the severity of her injuries, she was transferred again, this time to Maine Medical Center in Portland, the state's largest and most comprehensive hospital, nearly 100 miles from where she had been shot. She did not survive. Maine Medical Center in Portland became the place where Michaela Rose DeSantis' life ended. She was 23 years old. She was 2 months from her birthday. She was a woman who baked for the people she loved, who painted, who showed up for her little sister, who came to the mountains for the season and never made it home. While Michaela was being raced south toward Portland in a medical transport, Austin Doucette was not waiting for the police. He was moving. He got into a car and drove away from the Left Bank condo complex, away from the mountain, away from the 911 dispatchers he had been speaking to, away from the first responders who had arrived. Officers began pursuit. At some point during that chase, while Michaela was still alive, still being kept alive by the people working on her in 2 different hospitals, Austin called his father. He told his father that he was being chased by the police. And then he told his father something that transformed the urgency of the pursuit from an arrest into a potential second crisis. He said he was going to kill himself. A man who had just shot his girlfriend twice, who was now fleeing law enforcement through the Maine countryside in the dark, calling his father to say he was about to take his own life. The picture that assembled itself in those minutes was one of complete, catastrophic disintegration. The boundary between the tragedy in the condo and a second tragedy on a dark Maine road seemed thin and uncertain. Officers caught Austin Doucette as he fled. He was taken into custody on the evening of March 9, 2026, the day after the shooting, after Michaela had been transferred to Portland. He was arrested on a warrant issued by Farmington District Court and charged with the murder of Michaela Rose DeSantis. The specific charge was intentional or knowing murder, a distinction in Maine law that separates a person who acts with conscious awareness that death will result from one who acts recklessly or with negligence. The charge did not align with Austin Doucette's claim that the shooting had been accidental. It reflected, instead, the judgment of investigators from the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit, the division assigned to the state's most serious homicides, that what had happened in that condo on the evening of March 8th was not an accident. Austin Doucette was placed in the Franklin County Jail. He was held without bail. He was 24 years old. In Colchester, Connecticut, and in every place where Michaela DeSantis had left an impression, the grief arrived the way sudden grief always does, not as a gradual process but as a rupture, a before and an after, separated by a single phone call. Max DeSantis, Michaela's younger sister, the child who had grown up with her, who had gone at it with her sometimes the way sisters do, who had looked up to her as the best big sister and the greatest role model she could have asked for, sat down and created a GoFundMe page the night of March 9th, while Michaela was still technically alive, still being cared for in Portland. The page was created to raise money for funeral and burial costs, which meant that even as Max wrote those words, she understood at some level how the story was ending. In the description, Max wrote about her sister with a plainness that was, in its simplicity, more devastating than any elaborate tribute could have been. She wrote that Michaela was the most heartfelt, well-minded woman she had ever been around. She wrote that Michaela loved to bake for her loved ones, loved to do crafts, loved to paint, enjoyed going to work and being around people who supported her and loved her for who she was. And then, in the voice of a little sister who had not yet fully accepted the mathematics of what had happened, she wrote, "I never imagined I'd have her taken away from me this soon, or ever. There's nothing I wouldn't do to have her back. Michaela did not deserve what happened to her." That sentence, written by a 20-something woman about her 23-year-old sister, uploaded to a fundraising page on the internet on the night that her sister lay in a hospital bed, became the sentence that hundreds of strangers read over the following days as they donated to the page. By Tuesday night, more than $10,000 had been raised. By Wednesday, the total had surpassed $15,000. People who had never met Michaela Rose DeSantis sent money toward burying her because her sister's words found them where they sat, and because what had happened was simply, plainly wrong in the way that only a very specific kind of violence is wrong. The kind that comes from inside a relationship that was supposed to be safe. "My sister was shot and killed by somebody who was supposed to take care of her and remind her that she was loved every day," Max wrote. Her life was taken by her boyfriend of almost 8 years. 7 years. Nearly 8. The length of a shared life, of growing up together, of all the ordinary evenings and all the ordinary fights, and all the ordinary tenderness that make up a relationship that the people inside it probably thought would simply continue. On Wednesday, March 11th, 2026, 3 days after the shooting, Austin Doucette appeared in a Franklin County courtroom via Zoom, his face filling a screen in a room he was not physically inside, because he was still in the Franklin County Jail, held without bail. His attorney was present. The judge assigned to the case planned to hold a meeting with the attorneys in April to determine how the case would proceed. Before a trial could happen, Doucette's attorney could request what is called a harnished bail hearing, a proceeding in which a judge evaluates whether the prosecution has sufficient evidence to justify holding the accused without the option of bail. Through his attorney and through the statements captured in court documents, Austin Doucette's position was clear. He maintained that the shooting had been accidental, that the gun went off without his intending it to fire, that he had not meant to shoot Michaela. The calls to 911, the repeated insistence that the gun had accidentally discharged, the apology spoken to his girlfriend on the floor, were in his framing the words of a person in shock, not the words of a person concealing a deliberate act. But prosecutors and investigators saw the evidence differently. 2 gunshot wounds to the chest were not the physical signature of a single accidental discharge. They were the result of the trigger being pulled, the gun firing, a wound being inflicted, and then, with Michaela DeSantis already shot, the trigger being pulled again. The Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit, which had taken over the investigation along with support from the Carabasset Valley Police Department and the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, had concluded that what happened on the evening of March 8th was intentional or knowing murder. In the language of the law, intentional or knowing murder means that the person charged understood what they were doing and continued doing it. It means that the consequences, death, were not unforeseen. It means that whatever happened in that condo on Left Bank in Carabasset Valley, it was not a fumbled firearm discharging in a moment of carelessness. The investigation remained active. The Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit continued its work, gathering evidence, documenting the scene, speaking with witnesses and neighbors and co-workers at Sugarloaf. The resort itself had issued a statement in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. 2 members of the Sugarloaf team had been involved in an incident. One had tragically passed away, and the second had been asked not to return to work or be present on Sugarloaf property until the investigation was resolved. The mountain continued to operate. Skiers continued to ride the lifts. The white trails continued down through the trees. Life at Sugarloaf, by necessity, went on, but the condo at Left Bank, the room where Michaela DeSantis had spent the last moments of her life among the things she had brought from Colchester and arranged in the way a person arranges a temporary home, held its silence now. 7 years together. 2 gunshot wounds. A GoFundMe for a burial. These facts do not exist in isolation. They exist in a country where a woman is killed by an intimate partner with terrible regularity, where the person who is supposed to love her is the most statistically dangerous person in her life, and where the shock of that reality is felt most acutely by the people left behind, the sisters and the parents and the friends who did not see it coming because there was nothing visible to see, or because what was visible did not carry the weight it deserved, or because a relationship of 7 years does not easily become the thing you suspect of harboring the worst. Michaela's sister Max did not know, when she dropped her sister off at the mountain, that she was saying goodbye. Michaela did not know, when she walked into the condo on the evening of March 8th, that she would be carried out of it. The people at Sugarloaf who worked alongside her in Austin, who saw them together in the way co-workers see couples, casually in passing, in the background of ordinary work days, did not know that the evening of a Sunday in March would become the defining event of all their memories of her. That is the specific cruelty of intimate partner violence as a category of loss. It happens inside the private structure of a relationship, behind a closed door, in the space where the world is not watching and is not expected to be watching, because that space is supposed to be the safest space a person has. As of mid-March 2026, Austin Doucette remains held without bail at the Franklin County Jail, awaiting the next step in a legal process that is still in its earliest stages. No trial date has been set. No plea has been formally entered. The case is, in the language of the courts, pending, suspended in the long institutional pause between an arrest and a verdict, during which lawyers prepare, motions are filed, evidence is reviewed, and the machinery of justice moves at its own measured pace. Meanwhile, in Colchester, Connecticut, a family carries a grief that has no legal status, no case number, no procedural timeline. It simply exists, wide and silent, in the place where Michaela used to be, in the kitchen where she baked, in the space on the couch where she sat, in the sister who writes about her in the present tense because the past tense is still too sharp to hold. She painted. She baked. She went to the mountains for the season. She was 2 months from her birthday. She was 23 years old, and she had 7 more years of life ahead of her for every year she had already lived, and all of it, all of the baking and the painting and the crafts and the mornings with the mountain outside the window, was taken from her in a condo unit on Left Bank, in a valley in western Maine, on a Sunday evening in early March. The Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit will continue its investigation. The court in Franklin County will hold its hearings. The legal system will do what legal systems do, slowly, methodically, with its particular vocabulary of charges and motions and verdicts. But the verdict that matters most, the one that cannot be handed down by any court, is the one that Max DeSantis already wrote into a GoFundMe page in the hours after her sister was shot. Michaela Rose DeSantis did not deserve what happened to her. She deserved to come home from the mountain. She deserved to turn 24. She deserved more than 7 years, more than a Sunday evening, more than a phone call that ends everything. She deserved all the rest of it. Story 2. There is a particular cruelty in the way some stories end, not with closure, but with questions that echo long after the last headline fades. The story of Charity Bielis is one of those stories. It is a story about a woman who fought for her family, for her safety, and for her voice in a system she believed had abandoned her. It ends in a house in Arkansas on a cold December morning, with 3 lives cut impossibly short. And even after investigators put their findings on paper, an entire community was left asking, was justice ever truly served? Bonanza, Arkansas is the kind of place where everyone knows your name. Nestled in Sebastian County in the western corner of the state, it is a small, quiet community where neighbors wave from front porches and local doctors are respected pillars of society. For a long time, the Bialis family seemed to fit perfectly into that picture. Charity Bialis was 40 years old, a woman of striking intensity, someone who had lived through considerable hardship and emerged, at least publicly, with fierce determination. She had written a book, a memoir she titled A Lifetime of Miracles, Transformation Through Tragedy, which spoke to both her resilience and her willingness to confront painful truths head-on. She was a mother, above all else, fiercely devoted to her 6-year-old twins, Eliana and Maverick, born in 2019. 2 children who carried the same spark of life their mother radiated. Her husband, Dr. Randall Bialis, was 57 years old, a physician in the community, a man whose professional standing lent him a kind of quiet authority. The two had married in 2015 and built what, from the outside, appeared to be a comfortable and established life. They lived in a large home in Bonanza, a mansion, really, worth nearly 4 times the average home price in that town. And together they were raising the twins. But behind those walls, something had been fracturing for years. February 16th, 2025 was the night the private wounds of the Bialis marriage became a matter of public record. On that evening, according to court filings and law enforcement records, Randall Bialis allegedly choked his wife, and he did so in front of their 2 young children. The moment a person places their hands around another person's throat, something irreversible happens. Not just physically, but psychologically. For Charity, that night was the breaking point. For the children, Eliana and Maverick, it was the kind of moment that no 6-year-old should ever have to witness. A moment that would plant seeds of fear where there should have been only safety. Randall was arrested and charged with aggravated assault on a family member, 3rd-degree domestic battery, and 2 counts of endangering the welfare of a minor. The charges were serious, and they painted a picture of a home in crisis. Charity and Randall stopped living together that same month. For Charity, the filing of those charges was not just a legal proceeding, it was a lifeline. She filed for divorce on March 5, 2025, just days after the arrest, asking the court for full custody of her twins and a protective order for herself and her children. She believed the system would protect her. She believed that the law would stand between her family and the man she feared. She was about to discover how complicated that belief could be. As the months wore on, Charity grew increasingly desperate, not because she had stopped fighting, but because the fight felt increasingly tilted against her. In October 2025, Randall pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of 3rd-degree battery. What had begun as an aggravated assault charge, a serious felony, was whittled down to a misdemeanor. He received a 1-year suspended sentence, meaning he would serve no jail time at all. He was fined just $1,500 and ordered to attend a domestic violence program. He was also issued a no-contact order with Charity and her family, an order Charity herself had agreed to. To many observers, it looked like a man who had walked away with consequences so light they barely registered. Charity was furious. She was frightened, and she was watching her divorce case become increasingly unmanageable. Over the course of the proceedings, she cycled through 4 different attorneys and ultimately found herself standing alone in a courtroom, representing herself in what would become the final chapter of her marriage. In August 2025, somewhere between the legal filings and the sleepless nights, Charity turned to social media. She shared a screenshot of a news article on Facebook. The headline read, "If a partner has ever strangled you, they will likely kill you." The article cited a chilling statistic, that a woman whose partner has strangled her, even once, faces a higher risk of being killed by that same partner with a gun compared to a woman who has never been strangled. She shared it without extended commentary. She didn't need to. The message was unmistakable. She also commented publicly on a local news article that summer, writing words that, in retrospect, feel almost prophetic. "I'm living this battle right now. I am the victim, yet I've been treated like the problem while the criminal, a local doctor, is being shielded by the very system that's supposed to protect us. I've tried to reach the prosecuting attorney, but he won't even accept a letter from me. My voice as the victim has been shut out. This is not just about me. This is about a system that protects offenders and rejects victims. Lives are at stake, including the lives of young children. It was a cry into the void. The kind of cry that is heard by many but acted upon by few. The community saw her words. Her friends read them. And the system she was addressing continued to move at its own measured, indifferent pace. By the time December arrived, Charity Bealise had been fighting for nearly 10 months. The divorce case number 66 GDR 25-40 in Sebastian County Circuit Court, had reached its conclusion. On December 2nd, 2025, Charity walked into that courtroom for the final time. She was representing herself. No attorney stood beside her. And the thing she had been fighting hardest to protect, full custody of Eliana and Maverick, slipped from her grasp before she ever left the building. The judge issued a ruling ordering joint custody of the twins, to be shared between Charity and her estranged husband. For Charity, who had spent months trying to shield her children from the man she believed had endangered them, this was not just a legal loss. It was, in her mind, a fundamental failure, a verdict from the system that she had already publicly accused of protecting her abuser and silencing her. According to the sheriff's office, an examination of the deposition transcripts and hearing records revealed that Charity did not want the divorce at all. She had wanted reconciliation with Randall, and that reconciliation had not happened. She had filed for divorce out of fear, out of safety, and now she faced the prospect of sending her children back to the man who had, in her own words and in the documented court record, harmed her. She left that courtroom shattered. That night, sometime around 10 p.m., something changed inside the Bealise home. Charity accessed her phone and deactivated the home's security system, a system to which she had exclusive access. The house went dark in a way that went beyond the lights. Whatever happened in those hours, whatever thoughts crowded her mind in the silence after the ruling, the world outside the house did not know. Nobody would know until morning. At 9:30 in the morning on December 3rd, 2025, deputies from the Sebastian County Sheriff's Office arrived at the Bealise home in Bonanza in response to a welfare check call. Someone, a friend, a family member, a concerned soul, had not heard from Charity and had grown worried enough to call for help. When the deputies arrived, no one answered the door. They knocked. They waited. The house was still. 2 workers present at the property eventually helped them gain entry. What they found inside stopped them cold. Charity Bealise lay dead, a gunshot wound marking the end of everything she had been. Beside her, in the same home she had tried so hard to fight for, so hard to protect as a refuge for her children, were the bodies of Eliana and Maverick, 6-year-old twins, the 2 small people who had been the entire point of all her fighting. All 3 had been shot. The home that had once been photographed as a symbol of success, a grand house on a quiet street, had become a crime scene. Yellow tape replaced the quietude. The community of Bonanza, which had watched the Bealise divorce case unfold in headlines and whispers, now stood in stunned, grieving silence. News spread quickly. By the end of the day, Charity's name was no longer just attached to a contentious divorce. It was attached to a tragedy that reached far beyond Sebastian County. In the days immediately following the discovery, the Sebastian County Sheriff's Office was tight-lipped. A statement released on December 9th outlined the basic facts, but offered no suspects, no definitive cause of death, no answers to the questions burning through the community. Randall Bealise was publicly stated not to be a suspect as of that initial phase of the investigation. His attorney, Michael Pierce, maintained clearly that his client bore no responsibility for what had happened. Mr. Bealise was not responsible for the death of Mrs. Bealise nor his children's deaths. Mr. Bealise has cooperated with law enforcement and fully supports the investigation. Meanwhile, the investigation was growing. The United States Secret Service and Homeland Security investigations joined the effort alongside local law enforcement. 12 search warrants were initiated, 6 of them served. The breadth of the federal involvement suggested that investigators were following threads that reached beyond a straightforward domestic tragedy. The community held its breath. Social media filled with theories, grief, outrage, and demands for transparency. Friends and neighbors who had followed Charity's public pleas, her Facebook posts, her comments calling out the system, felt an overwhelming sense of dread that their fears had proven justified. 1 month passed. Then two. On March 4, 2026, the Sebastian County Sheriff's Office released the findings of autopsies conducted by the Arkansas State Crime Lab, the official medical and forensic verdict on how 3 lives had ended. The conclusions were as heartbreaking as they were contested. Eliana and Maverick, both 6 years old, had died by homicide. They had been killed by someone else's hand. The children had not chosen their fate. They had been helpless, as all children are, dependent on the adults around them to keep them safe. And that safety had been catastrophically, irreversibly violated. Charity Bealise, the autopsy found, had died by suicide. The official narrative constructed by authorities was one of a woman at her breaking point. A woman who had not wanted her marriage to end, who had lost the custody battle she had staked everything on, who had deactivated the security system in the dark of night and taken actions that ended her own life and the lives of her twins. It was a narrative of a mind consumed by grief, desperation, and a sense of total loss. A mother who, in the most agonizing possible interpretation, could not bear the thought of her children being returned to a life she believed would harm them. For some, it was a conclusion that made a terrible kind of emotional sense. A woman driven to the edge by a system that had repeatedly failed her. A woman who had publicly declared that lives were at stake and then watched those lives, including her own, be lost. For others, however, the conclusion only deepened the wound. It was noted, for instance, that the case's history was far more tangled than the headline of "Domestic Abuse Victim Loses Custody and Takes Tragic Action" could capture. Investigators and journalists digging into the background of both Charity and Randall uncovered a complex, painful history, including allegations and legal entanglements that stretched back more than a decade. Randall's previous wife, Shauna, had died in 2012 from a gunshot wound to the forehead in a case that was ruled a suicide, a detail that cast an unsettling shadow over events. Charity herself had faced serious legal troubles in her past, including a 2013 arrest for allegedly pointing a firearm at a man, and court proceedings in which her own father had raised concerns about her fitness for custody of an older son. These were not details that absolved anyone or condemned anyone, but they were details that resisted the clean, simple narrative that headlines demanded. The truth, as is so often the case in tragedies of this depth, lived in the murky space between what could be proven and what could only be felt. The community around Bonanza continued to seek answers long after the official statement was released. Advocates for domestic violence victims pointed to Charity's case as a devastating example of how the legal system can fail the most vulnerable. How a woman can scream for help in print, in court filings, in social media posts, and still find the doors of justice closed to her. Others demanded deeper investigation, unsatisfied that the case had been closed with the weight of its complications unaddressed. The children, Eliana and Maverick, became, in the public consciousness, the most heartbreaking symbols of a system-wide failure. 2 6-year-olds who had done nothing except be born into a family in crisis. 2 children who had witnessed their father arrested, their mother crying, their home transformed from a safe place into a battlefield. 2 children who deserved, above everything else, simply to grow up. There is a special kind of grief that settles over a community when the answers they are given do not feel like enough. Bonanza, Arkansas carries that grief. The house on the quiet street sits as a kind of monument to what happens when the warning signs are visible and the safety nets fail to catch the falling. Charity Bealise wrote, in her own words, that lives were at stake, including the lives of young children. She wrote it in August, for months before December 3rd. She posted it for the world to see and tagged it with calls for accountability and justice. She had published a memoir about transforming tragedy into miracles. And in the end, the tragedy arrived and the miracle did not. Whether one accepts the official findings or carries questions about them, the human truth at the center of this case does not change. 3 people, a mother and her 2 babies, died in a house in Arkansas the morning after a court hearing. A community lost its innocence about what can happen when pain is left unaddressed. And the legal system that Charity had publicly accused of protecting offenders and silencing victims now carried, whether it acknowledged it or not, the weight of her final, unanswered cries for help. The case of Charity Bealise is officially closed. The questions it left behind are not. Story 3. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a small New England town when something terrible has happened. Not the natural quiet of autumn woods and cooling air, but a held-breath stillness that carries the weight of disbelief. That is the silence that fell over Gardner, Massachusetts, on the morning of Sunday, October 22nd, 2023, when 4 young children walked out of their house on Cherry Street, crossed the yard, and knocked on a neighbor's door to ask for help. The oldest among them was 9 years old. The youngest had barely learned to walk. What they left behind in that house would shake their community to its foundation and set in motion one of the most haunting fugitive manhunts in the state's recent memory. The woman they left behind was their mother. Her name was Brianne Pennington. Everyone who loved her called her Breezy. Brianne Pennington was 30 years old when she died, a young woman full of warmth, devotion, and a quiet resilience that her family had watched her develop over a lifetime. She had been raised in part by her aunt, Brenda Hull, a woman of fierce loyalty, who would later become the loudest voice demanding justice in her niece's name. Breezy was, by all accounts, the kind of mother who centered her world entirely on her children, 4 of them aged 2, 5, 7, and 9. She was a member of the Mormon faith, and the church community in Gardner had become a vital part of her daily life, a circle of friends and support that gave structure and warmth to a home that had, in recent years, grown increasingly difficult to live in. Her husband was Aaron Pennington, 33 years old, a veteran of the United States Air Force who had served his country and returned to civilian life carrying wounds that were not always visible. Aaron stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and had on paper the life that many people dream of building. After leaving the military, he had secured a position at Raytheon, the defense contractor, and in June 2022, the couple purchased a home at 42 Cherry Street in Gardner for $475,000, a modest, tree-lined street in a town of roughly 20,000 people, set among the lakes and forests of central Massachusetts. It looked, from the outside, like the beginning of a stable, prosperous chapter. But behind the walls of that Cherry Street home, the chapter being written was a far darker one. Aaron Pennington had a documented history of mental health struggles. His difficulties had long strained the marriage, and those close to the family had grown increasingly worried about the toll his condition was taking on Brianne and the children. He left his job at Raytheon in March 2023, a decision that closed off the family's primary source of income and deepened the instability already present in the household. Brenda Hull, who knew both Aaron and Brianne well from years of close family contact, would later offer a more pointed assessment of Aaron's pattern of behavior. In her view, every time Aaron faced a responsibility he no longer wanted, a demanding job, a difficult deployment, obligations he wished to escape, a mental health crisis would materialize as though on cue. She was careful not to dismiss the reality of mental illness, but she questioned whether Aaron had learned to weaponize the diagnosis as a shield and an exit strategy. What is not in dispute is the state of the marriage by the fall of 2023. Brianne Pennington had made a decision. She was going to leave. She had been making plans to relocate to Texas, to take her 4 children south and start a new life away from her husband, away from the tension, away from the fear that had seeped into the walls of the Cherry Street house. She wanted distance. She wanted safety. She wanted a future for herself and her kids. Whether Aaron knew the full extent of her plans is unclear. What is clear is that he knew enough to be afraid of losing control. In the days just before the murder, Aaron Pennington had traveled to California to visit his parents. The trip might have seemed ordinary, a man visiting family, perhaps trying to clear his head during a troubled time in his marriage. But the details of that visit, pieced together by investigators and relayed by Brenda Hull, suggest something far more deliberate was taking shape. Aaron borrowed an undisclosed sum of cash from his father, physical money, the kind that leaves no digital trail. And on his way home from the airport, he allegedly told a friend something that would later send chills through everyone who heard it. He said he was 10 steps ahead of everyone. It is a phrase that sounds like confidence, even arrogance. But when you hold it against everything that followed, it reads as something else entirely. The quiet, chilling announcement of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. The day before the murder, Saturday, October 21st, Aaron Pennington moved through the family home in a state of agitation. He was searching for something, moving from room to room with an urgency that those who later reconstructed the timeline found deeply significant. Brenda Hull now believes he was searching for a gun, a Walther pistol that had belonged to Brianne's grandfather and had been given to her for her own protection. It was Brianne's gun. It was meant to keep her safe. That evening, at precisely 7:04 p.m., Aaron opened his phone and typed a note. The note was brief, clinical, and monstrous in its clarity. It read, "Don't say anything. Be quiet. If she wakes up, just say you're getting nasal spray. Get on side of bed, very close proximity to head. Put hole in her head." The timestamp on that note was the night before his wife was killed. The morning of Sunday, October 22nd, 2023, began like any other Sunday for the Pennington children. They were getting ready for church. The family was part of the local Mormon congregation, and Sunday mornings carried a familiar rhythm of preparation. Clothes to be found, shoes to be located, hair to be combed. Their mother, Breezy, was still asleep. Their father, it seems, had been waiting for exactly that. Then Aaron Pennington approached his sleeping wife and shot her 3 times in the back of the head. He used the gun she had been given for her own protection. She never had a chance. She was asleep. She was helpless. She did not wake up. What happened next reveals the degree to which Aaron Pennington had prepared for what came after. Rather than calling for help or remaining in the house, he blocked the bedroom door from the outside, pushing a dresser against it so that the children, or anyone else who came looking, could not easily enter. Then he climbed out through a window. Outside, standing in the yard on a Sunday morning in October, was his 9-year-old daughter. She looked at her father. He looked back at her. And then, according to her great aunt, he drove away, leaving his child to hold what was left of the world on her own. He looked his daughter in her eyes as he drove off, Hull would later say, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has had to repeat an unbearable truth too many times, knowing he was leaving her responsible for 4 children with a dead mother. The 9-year-old gathered her siblings, the 7-year-old, the 5-year-old, the toddler who was barely 2, and they walked to a neighbor's house. The neighbor called 911. Members of the family's church arrived first, forcing open the blocked bedroom door. They found Breezy in her bed, still warm. The discovery of Brianne Pennington's body set the machinery of law enforcement into immediate motion. Gardner Police and Massachusetts State Police responded to the Cherry Street home, confirmed what the church members had found, and began what would become one of the most intensive manhunts central Massachusetts had seen in years. The search for Aaron Pennington was on. The first break came the following night. On Monday, October 23rd, a hunter moving through a wooded area off Kelton Street in Gardner spotted something that didn't belong. A white BMW, parked deep in the trees near Camp Collier, a Boy Scouts campground approximately 3 miles from the Cherry Street house. It was Aaron Pennington's car, abandoned and empty. The discovery triggered an extraordinary response. Multiple police departments converged on the woodland. Massachusetts State Police deployed K-9 units and air wing helicopters. Investigators on foot combed through more than 200 acres of dense forest in the days that followed, pushing through undergrowth and over uneven terrain, looking for any sign of the man they were hunting. A shelter-in-place order was issued for Gardner residents in the surrounding area as authorities worked to establish whether Pennington was armed and still in the vicinity. After a week of searching, aerial surveillance, canine tracking, hundreds of boots on the ground, they found nothing. Aaron Pennington had vanished. On October 24th, investigators obtained a search warrant for his phone, and the contents of that note, the one typed at 7:04 p.m. the night before his wife was murdered, confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was not a crime of passion, not a sudden snap under unbearable pressure. It was premeditated. It was planned. The note laid out, in methodical steps, exactly how he intended to kill her, including the instruction to remain quiet if she stirred in her sleep. Within days, Aaron Pennington was formally charged with murder. A warrant was issued for his arrest. He was listed as armed and dangerous. The investigation moved in two parallel directions from that point. One thread was the formal legal case, the charges, the warrants, the mounting evidence that would be used to prosecute Aaron Pennington if he was ever found. The other thread was the search itself, which continued for months and then stretched into years, drawing in not only law enforcement but the family Brianne had left behind. Brenda Hull became the family's public face in that search. She had raised Breezy, had watched her grow into a mother and a woman, and she was not prepared to let her niece's death disappear into the cold case files that swallow so many victims' stories. She spoke to news outlets, gave interviews, pushed for continued attention and resources. She lobbied against the case going cold. She made it personal, because for her, it was personal in the most profound way possible. Hull's belief about Aaron Pennington's fate stands in stark contrast to the possibility that some investigators have cautiously entertained. Some who worked the case have considered the possibility that Pennington may have taken his own life in the woods near Camp Collier. There were notes on his phone suggesting suicidal ideation, and the surrounding terrain, vast and difficult, could have concealed remains for years. But Hull is unconvinced. She pointed out that Pennington had borrowed cash before the murder, cash that leaves no record. She noted that Camp Collier sits within 10 miles of a cargo rail line, the kind of route someone could use to quietly leave the region. She observed that the campground is active, used regularly by scouts and families, and no human remains have ever been found there. And she returned, again and again, to those 5 journals, 5 years' worth of daily entries in Aaron Pennington's own handwriting, in which she found not a single reference to depression or thoughts of suicide. Nobody hides their car and then hides themselves to commit suicide, she said, when they know they have 4 children that they supposedly love, and who would then be entitled to their death benefits. In her view, the man who told a friend he was 10 steps ahead of everyone did not walk into the woods to die. He walked into the woods to disappear. As time passed, the search evolved rather than diminished. In November 2025, more than 2 years after Brianne's murder, police announced new evidence that led them back to the area near Camp Collier. Gardner Police and Massachusetts State Police K, 9 units and helicopter crews conducted fresh searches of the woodland, focusing on areas they had not yet fully explored. Brenda Hull was told by authorities that new evidence had surfaced, though the specifics were not disclosed publicly. She held on to both possibilities with the pragmatism of someone who has had to make peace with uncertainty. If his remains were found, it would bring legal clarity for the children and access to survivor benefits they were owed. If he was alive, she wanted him caught. Either way, she said, the case would not be allowed to go cold. Aaron Pennington, as of the most recent reporting, remains at large. He is described as a white male, 6 feet 2 inches tall, approximately 175 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes, though investigators and Hull alike note that his appearance may have changed in the years since the murder. He is considered armed and dangerous. Anyone with information is urged to contact Massachusetts State Police detectives at the Worcester County District Attorney's Office or Gardner Police. The 4 children Breezy left behind were 2, 5, 7, and 9 years old when they lost their mother on an October morning while getting ready for church. They are older now. They carry memories, some clear, some fragmented, of a woman who loved them completely, and of a morning that changed everything they thought they knew about the world. Their great-aunt Brenda Hull, the same woman who raised their mother, has become their fierce advocate, their voice, the person determined to ensure that what happened to Breezy is neither forgotten nor left unresolved. In interviews, Hull has spoken about the children's questions, about where their father is, about why he left, about what it means that he has not come back. She relayed a message to him through the press, one that is heartbreaking in its simplicity and devastating in its context. "I want him to know," she said, "that his children are asking about him, that they love him, that they have good memories of him, and they want to see him. That a mother's murderer should be told, by the woman who raised the mother, that the children still want their father. That is perhaps the most human and most painful dimension of this entire story. It is the dimension that resists easy resolution, that sits outside the clean categories of justice and punishment, that reminds us that real crimes do not end when the crime scene tape comes down. They ripple outward, through years and generations, through the hearts of children who had no say in any of it. Breanne Breezy Pennington deserved a different story. She deserved the life she was trying to build, the one that had her packing for Texas, loading up her 4 kids, pointing herself toward a future free from fear. She was 30 years old, vibrant enough that people still called her by a nickname that captured something light and alive about her. She had a grandfather who gave her a gun because he wanted her safe. She had a church community that cared enough to come when the children went for help. She had an aunt who loved her so fiercely that, more than 2 years after her death, that aunt is still refusing to let her name go quiet. As of early 2026, Erin Pennington remains one of Massachusetts' most wanted fugitives. The woods near Camp Collier have been searched and searched again. The phone note sits in the evidence file, time-stamped and damning. The murder charge hangs open, waiting for the moment, if it ever comes, when justice catches up to the man who left his daughter standing in the yard on a Sunday morning and drove away. Until then, the case remains what Brenda Hull refuses to let it become, unfinished. And Breezy remains what she always was, a mother, a daughter, a woman who deserved so much more than the morning she was given. Story 4. The night of December 27, 1986, carried with it the quiet aftermath of the Christmas holiday, a softness in the California air, the last few days of a year winding toward its close. In El Cajon, a modest suburb nestled in the foothills east of San Diego, Sam and Joyce Knott were at home waiting. Their daughter, Cara, had called to say she was leaving her boyfriend Wayne's place in Escondido and heading south on Interstate 15. It was a drive she had made many times before, a familiar stretch of freeway cutting through the dark hills of San Diego County. She was 20 years old, a junior at San Diego State University, and she was the kind of daughter that parents brag about, responsible, warm, full of life. She had promised to call when she arrived home. She never did. Cara Evelyn Knott had grown up knowing she was loved. Born on February 11, 1966, she was one of 5 children in a tight-knit family that drew its identity from togetherness. Her parents, Sam and Joyce, were the kind of people whose home was always open, always a meal on the table, always a place to gather. Cara had inherited that warmth completely. Friends described her as vivacious and caring, someone who lit up a room simply by walking into it. She was studying at San Diego State, building toward a future that seemed, in every way, bright. Her boyfriend Wayne was serious and steady, and the two were close. That Saturday after Christmas, she had spent the day with him at his family's home in Escondido, and as the evening deepened, she kissed him goodbye and climbed into her white Volkswagen Beetle for the 40-mile drive south. The route was simple. She would take Interstate 15 southbound all the way down into El Cajon. Wayne watched her go. He had no reason to worry. Nobody did. Miles away on that same interstate, a California Highway Patrol cruiser sat in the dark, its engine idling quietly at the side of the road. Behind the wheel was Craig Allen Pyre, badge number 13920, a 13-year veteran of the CHP, a man who had spent over a decade in uniform, earning a reputation that his colleagues considered spotless. At 36 years old, Pyre was not just a patrol officer. He was a familiar face in the San Diego media landscape, a man who occasionally served as a department spokesman, appearing on local television news broadcasts to offer safety tips to drivers. He was polished, personable, and trusted, but beneath that carefully constructed surface, something very different had been quietly growing for months. For at least 6 months before that December night, Pyre had been using his badge as a tool of predation. His method was specific and deliberate. He would wait along Interstate 15, near the Mercy Road off-ramp, a dark, unfinished exit that went nowhere, ending in a dead-end stretch of road far from the lights of the freeway. When he spotted a woman driving alone, he would activate his patrol lights and direct her to pull off at that off-ramp. Once there, away from passing traffic and the visibility of the highway, he would linger. He would ask questions that had nothing to do with traffic violations. He would talk about personal matters, make comments that edged toward the inappropriate. In some cases, he reached through an open window and gently stroked the hair or shoulders of the women he had stopped. Women who felt they could not object, because he was a police officer and they were alone in the dark. The stops lasted far longer than any legitimate traffic encounter could justify. Some women reported being detained for 30 minutes. Others described waiting an hour and 40 minutes before Pyre finally let them go. Pyre had stopped more than 24 women at night on Interstate 15, requiring each of them to exit at the Mercy Road off-ramp, even if it meant they had to back their cars up along the freeway against oncoming traffic to reach it. When Pyre stopped men, the encounters were brisk, professional, and conducted on the freeway itself. They lasted less than 10 minutes. The contrast was unmistakable and damning. Complaints had been made. Several women had reported Pyre's behavior to the CHP before the night of December 27th. Every one of those complaints had been quietly dismissed. Pyre's reputation within the department was too strong, too clean. Nobody wanted to believe it. Kara's white Volkswagen passed a Chevron gas station about 2 miles north of the Mercy Road off-ramp sometime that evening. Then a marked CHP patrol car making a U-turn in the road, just after Kara had driven away, pulling out as if to follow her. What happened next unfolded in the dark isolation of that dead-end off-ramp. Pyre's lights must have flashed in Kara's rearview mirror, the familiar blue and red of a patrol car telling her to pull over. She would have had no reason to question it. You don't question a police officer. You pull over. And so she did, turning her little Volkswagen onto the Mercy Road off-ramp and coming to a stop at the end of that unfinished road, where the night was absolute and the freeway noise faded behind her. What began as a traffic stop became something else entirely. Nobody was a witness to what was said between them, but investigators would later piece together a picture from the evidence. At some point, Kara not understood that this stop was not legitimate. At some point, she threatened to report Pyre for what he was doing, and at some point, he reached for her. Kara did not go quietly. She fought. She slashed and scratched at his face with her fingers, leaving deep marks across his skin that would be visible for days afterward, marks that would ultimately help to destroy him. But she was alone in the dark, far from anyone who could help, and Craig Pyre was a large, physically powerful man who had planned this place and this moment. He struck her across the head with his heavy flashlight, the blow leaving a significant bruise above her right eye. Then he took a rope that would later be found in the trunk of his patrol car, and he strangled her. When it was done, Pyre carried Kara's body to the nearby Los Penasquitos Creek Arch Bridge, a structure that spanned a 65-foot ravine dropping into brush and creek bed below. He threw her over the edge. Her body fell into the undergrowth at the bottom of the ravine, hidden in the dark, invisible from the road above. Then Craig Pyre drove away. The drive back gave him time to think. He stopped at a gas station, and the attendant there would later tell investigators that Pyre appeared disheveled, frantic, arriving at high speed. But Pyre was a man practiced in the performance of composure. He had a cover story to construct, paperwork to manipulate, and a logbook to alter. He changed the recorded times on several traffic tickets he had written that evening, adjusting the timestamps to create the appearance that he had been somewhere else at the moment the murder occurred. He falsified entries in his own logbook. The alterations were clumsy and incomplete. The motorists who had received those tickets would later tell investigators that the times Pyre recorded did not match when they were actually stopped. The paperwork trail he tried to erase only made the trap tighter. Meanwhile, the Knott family waited through the night. When Kara did not call, Sam and Joyce began to worry. When hours passed and she still did not arrive, the worry became dread. They spent the night calling Wayne, calling hospitals, driving roads. They pleaded with police to take them seriously, to launch a search. Their daughter was not the kind of person who simply disappeared. Something was terribly wrong. But their urgency was met with the measured indifference of a system that, at that moment, did not yet understand what had happened on the Mercy Road off-ramp. On the morning of December 28th, Kara's white Volkswagen was found parked at the dead end of the Mercy Road off-ramp. The keys were still in the ignition. There were skid marks on the pavement nearby, heavy, wide marks inconsistent with the small Volkswagen, suggesting a much larger vehicle had been present. Shortly afterward, searchers found her body at the bottom of the ravine beneath the bridge. She was still dressed in the clothes she had been wearing when she left Wayne's house. She was 20 years old, and she was gone. The investigation that followed was conducted by San Diego homicide detectives, and from the beginning it carried an uncomfortable weight. Evidence at the scene pointed almost immediately toward a law enforcement vehicle. The skid marks suggested a large, heavy car. The Mercy Road off-ramp was not a place that a civilian would naturally know to drive a young woman. It was an unfinished road that led nowhere, the kind of place you would only know about if you patrolled it regularly. Then, 2 days after the murder, something extraordinary happened. A reporter from San Diego television station was riding along with the CHP to do a segment on highway safety for women driving alone at night. The officer they interviewed was Craig Pyre. He sat in his patrol car, speaking calmly into the camera about how women could protect themselves on the freeway, offering tips and reassurances, projecting exactly the image of a dedicated public servant. But as the camera rolled, viewers at home could see something that the camera could not hide: deep, fresh scratches running across Pyre's face, visible and raw. The broadcast aired, and within hours the phones began ringing. Nearly 24 women called the tip line. Their stories were strikingly similar. A CHP officer on Interstate 15, near the Mercy Road off-ramp, had pulled them over at night, directed them to that same isolated exit, and detained them for long, uncomfortable periods. Some described him reaching into their cars to touch their hair or shoulders. Some had filed complaints. All of them recognized the man they saw on television. They recognized the scratches. The CHP launched an internal investigation, and what it found was devastating. Pyre had been systematically targeting women. His stop records showed an unmistakable pattern. Almost all of his nighttime stops involved women driving alone, women who fit the same physical profile as Kara Knott. The Mercy Road off-ramp was his chosen location, time and again, stop after stop. The complaints that had been filed before the murder took on a new and terrible significance. They had been ignored, and now a 20-year-old woman was dead. Craig Pyre was arrested on January 15, 1987, 19 days after Kara Knott's murder. He was charged with first-degree murder. The case against him was built on circumstantial evidence, but it was extraordinarily thorough. Forensic scientists examining Kara's clothing found a distinctive fiber, a gold rayon thread with an unusual characteristic. It had been colored using a yellow pigment rather than a standard dye, a manufacturing specificity that made it essentially unique. That fiber matched the shoulder patch on Pyre's CHP uniform. Additional microscopic purple fibers connected him to the crime. 2 tiny spots of blood found on Kara's boot and sweatshirt were analyzed, and their type matched Craig Pyre. Specifically, his blood type was AB negative, one of the rarest blood types in existence, combined with other genetic markers that further narrowed the match. Tire tracks on the bridge above the ravine showed a car had accelerated away rapidly, leaving dark skid marks on the pavement, marks consistent with a heavy vehicle. The rope that investigators found in the trunk of Pyre's patrol car became one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the case. A forensic dentist named Norman Sperber examined the rope and determined that its configuration appeared consistent with the ligature marks found on Kara's neck. And then there was Pyre's own paperwork. The falsified logbook entries, the altered ticket timestamps, the motorists who came forward to contradict the times Pyre had recorded. Each piece of it pointed to a man who had been desperate and careless in the dark hours after the murder, trying to construct an alibi from official documents and failing. The scratches on his face, of course, could not be explained away. Pyre claimed he had fallen against a fence in the CHP parking lot. Investigators examined that fence. It was too tall, positioned in a way that made his story physically impossible. The first trial, beginning in early 1988, was one of the most followed criminal proceedings in San Diego County history. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous care. The fibers, the blood, the tire marks, the falsified records, the pattern of targeting women, the women who had called in after the television broadcast. The defense, led by attorney Robert Grimes, attacked each piece of evidence individually, hammering on the fact that the case was entirely circumstantial and that no witness had seen Pyre with Kara. Grimes pointed to inconsistencies in some of the women's testimonies and suggested the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated and came back deadlocked. 7 jurors in favor of conviction, 5 who were not convinced. A mistrial was declared. For the Knott family, who had sat through every agonizing day of testimony, it was a blow that went beyond description. They had watched the evidence unfold, certain of its meaning, and now had to prepare to go through it all again. The second trial proceeded with adjustments. Certain testimony that had been allowed in the first trial, including discussion of a potential second suspect and one witness's explanation for Pyre's scratches, was ruled inadmissible this time. The core evidence remained intact. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. Prosecutor Van Orshoven turned to the jury and posed a single question. For whom would Kara not pull over in the dark on an isolated road in the middle of the night? She would stop for a police officer, and a police officer killed her. That police officer was Craig Pyre. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty. First-degree murder. On August 4, 1988, Superior Court Judge Richard Huffman sentenced Craig Pyre to 25 years to life in prison. Before announcing the sentence, the judge made his own views unambiguous. He told the courtroom that he was absolutely convinced to a moral certainty that Pyre had killed Kara Knott, that the act had been done with deliberation and malice, and that he would remain convinced of that certainty for the rest of his life. It was, the judge said, the second time in California history that a CHP officer had been convicted of murder committed while on duty. Pyre remained silent. He offered no confession, no apology, no accounting. He has never admitted to the crime. The aftermath of Kara Knott's murder spread outward in ways that changed the world she had briefly inhabited. In the weeks following the television broadcast and Pyre's arrest, a troubling wave of incidents was reported across San Diego County. Women driving alone on the freeways who refused to pull over when signaled by patrol cars, terrified that the officer behind them might not be who his badge claimed he was. The trust between the public and law enforcement, at least for women driving alone at night, had been fractured in a way that would take years to rebuild. The case forced the California Highway Patrol to examine itself. The women who had filed complaints before December 27, 1986, complaints that had been dismissed, paperwork that had been filed away and forgotten, became a permanent indictment of the system's failure. Had those complaints been taken seriously, had anyone looked closely at what Craig Pyre was doing on that dark off-ramp night after night, Kara Knott might have driven home safely that evening. Sam Knott, Kara's father, turned his grief into a mission. He became an advocate for crime victims and safety, pushing for changes in how law enforcement handled complaints and how vulnerable people were protected. He worked tirelessly for years, carrying the weight of his daughter's absence in every effort he made. On November 30th, 2000, Sam Knott died of a heart attack. He collapsed only a few yards from the spot where Kara's body had been found, the same place where the family had built a memorial garden in her honor. He died, in a sense, where she had been left. Craig Pyre has been denied parole at every hearing. In 2004, after serving 17 years, he refused to provide a DNA sample to prosecutors who had offered to test the evidence against him. When the parole board asked him why, he refused to answer. The board cited his lack of remorse and denied his release. He was denied again in 2008 and again in 2012. His next parole hearing is scheduled for January 2027, when he will be nearly 77 years old. He is currently housed at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. His third wife, Karen, whom he had married just 18 months before the murder and who visited him faithfully in prison for years, eventually divorced him around 2007. The bridge from which Craig Pyre threw Kara Knott's body has since been renamed in her memory. It is now called the Kara Knott Memorial Bridge, a small, permanent acknowledgement that she was here, that she mattered, that what was done to her should never be forgotten. She was 20 years old when she died. She had gone to visit her boyfriend for the weekend and was driving home through the dark hills of San Diego County, doing nothing more extraordinary than millions of people do every night across this country. She trusted, as most people must trust, that the uniform behind those flashing lights meant safety, that the authority of the badge would protect her rather than threaten her, that the dark road she was directed down would lead her back to the freeway, back to the drive home, back to her parents waiting in El Cajon. She was wrong, but she was not passive. She fought back with everything she had in the final moments of her life. And those scratches, those marks she left on the face of the man who killed her, were the very evidence that eventually helped bring him to justice. In the end, Kara Knott's final act of defiance echoed far beyond that bridge. It rang through courtrooms, through jury deliberations, through a judge's voice declaring his moral certainty, through every woman who heard her story and understood what it meant to be vulnerable and brave at the same time. She did not make it home that December night, but she has never truly been forgotten. Story 5. The evening of September 6, 2018, began like countless others for Botham Jean. A quiet Thursday night at home after a long day of work. The 26-year-old accountant had settled into the comfortable rhythm of his life in Dallas, Texas, far from his birthplace on the Caribbean island nation of St. Lucia. He had earned his place at PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the world's most prestigious accounting firms, through dedication and an infectious enthusiasm that made him beloved among colleagues. Those who knew him remembered his radiant smile and his singing voice, which he shared generously during church services, and had once lifted in harmony with the good news singers at Harding University in Arkansas, where he graduated in 2016. On this particular evening, Botham had changed into shorts and settled onto his couch, a bowl of vanilla ice cream in hand, the glow of his television illuminating his fourth-floor apartment at the South Side Flats complex. Above him, on the fifth floor, at 31 years old, Geiger had built her identity around her badge and uniform, testifying later that officers in her department understood they were always on the job. That night, still dressed in her police uniform and carrying her service weapon, she navigated the parking garage of the apartment complex, where she lived directly above Botham Jean. What happened in the next few minutes would shatter two families, ignite a national conversation about policing and racial justice, and culminate in one of the most extraordinary courtroom moments in recent American legal history. The apartment building where both Geiger and Jean lived featured identical floor plans on each level, a detail that would become central to the tragedy about to unfold. Geiger later claimed that after her long shift, fatigue clouded her awareness as she ascended to what she believed was her own floor. She approached an apartment door that appeared familiar, not noticing the bright red doormat placed outside, a detail absent from her own apartment entrance one floor above. The door, she discovered, was slightly ajar, which she interpreted as a sign of a break-in. In reality, Jean's apartment had more furniture than hers, including a coffee table and ottoman positioned in front of the couch, and his television was substantially larger than the one in her residence. When Geiger pushed open the door and stepped inside, she encountered a figure in the dimness of the living room. She would later testify that she saw only a silhouette, a dark shape that triggered her training and ignited her fear. She drew her weapon and began issuing commands. Botham Jean, startled by the sudden intrusion into his home, attempted to comply with the shouted orders, rising slowly from his couch. He was unarmed, holding nothing more threatening than a spoon and a bowl of melting ice cream. In those terrible seconds, as Jean stood in his own living room, Geiger fired her handgun twice. One bullet struck him in the chest. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet evening. At 9:59 p.m., Geiger placed a call to 911, her voice conveying the shock of what had just occurred. Joshua Brown, a neighbor who had just returned from watching a football game at a sports bar, heard the commotion from the hallway. He would later testify that he heard voices indicating surprise, followed immediately by gunshots. No police commands, no warning, just the sudden violence that ended a young man's life. Brown witnessed Geiger emerge from the apartment, pacing back and forth while speaking on her phone, visibly distraught, before returning inside and then emerging again. Emergency responders transported Botham Jean to a nearby hospital, but the damage was irreversible. He died from his wound, his life extinguished in the place where he should have been safest, his own home. For his family, still in St. Lucia and scattered across the world, the news arrived with the cruel suddenness of all such tragedies. Their son, brother, and friend, who had traveled so far to build a life in America, who had worked diligently at his profession and sang joyfully at his church, would never come home again. The investigation that followed drew immediate attention from the Texas Rangers, who took over the case from the Dallas Police Department to ensure impartiality. The facts they uncovered painted a disturbing picture of that night. Evidence revealed that Geiger had been engaged in a romantic relationship with a fellow officer, Martin Rivera, and had been exchanging text messages with him both before and after the shooting. Some of these messages were sent even while she was reporting the incident to the 911 dispatcher. Both Geiger and Rivera later admitted from the witness stand that they had deleted messages following Jean's death, though prosecutors managed to recover them. The content suggested that Geiger may have been distracted by these exchanges as she approached what she thought was her apartment. 3 days after the shooting, authorities arrested Amber Geiger. Initially charged with manslaughter, the case sparked immediate controversy and protest. Community members and civil rights organizations questioned whether an ordinary citizen who had killed someone in a similar fashion would receive such lenient treatment. The dimensions of the case, a police officer killing an unarmed civil man in his own home, resonated powerfully in a nation still grappling with a series of high-profile police killings. The Dallas Police Department terminated Geiger's employment as the legal proceedings moved forward. The trial, which began in the fall of 2019, captured national attention. Prosecutors presented a case that went beyond the shooting itself, seeking to establish Geiger's character and state of mind. They introduced controversial text messages and social media posts, including communications they argued showed Geiger mocking the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and expressing frustration about working during an MLK Day parade. These revelations painted a picture of someone whose attitudes toward race might have influenced her split-second decision to fire her weapon at a man in his own apartment. The prosecution emphasized the numerous signs Geiger should have noticed that would have alerted her to being on the wrong floor and entering the wrong apartment. They pointed to the different furniture arrangement, the larger television, the red doormat, and the apartment number itself. Expert testimony from crime scene analyst Michael Maloney suggested that based on the physical evidence and Jean's autopsy, Botham was likely in the process of standing up from his couch when he was shot. Hardly the threatening posture Geiger had described. Prosecutor Laquita Long offered a poignant observation during closing arguments, noting that while Geiger testified she saw Jean as merely a silhouette in a dark room, Everyone who knew Botham Jean knew he was the brightest light in the room. The defense strategy centered on Geiger's mistaken belief that she was in her own apartment confronting an intruder. Her attorney, Michael Mola, argued that this mistake negated any intent to commit murder, suggesting that a charge of criminally negligent homicide would be more appropriate. Geiger herself took the stand, testifying through tears about that night. She recounted her exhaustion after the long shift, her terror at believing an intruder was in her home, and her training that taught her to perceive anyone whose hands she couldn't see as a threat. In an emotional moment, she expressed her wish that she had been the one shot instead of Jean. Chief Justice Robert D. Burns III interrupted the defense's argument with a crucial observation. Geiger had testified that she intentionally shot Jean. Her attorney acknowledged this, explaining that while she did intentionally pull the trigger, she believed she was justified in using deadly force because she thought she was defending herself from an intruder in her own home. This admission became central to the case. Geiger had meant to kill the person she shot, making the issue not one of intent, but of whether her belief justified that intent. On October 1st, 2019, after careful deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Amber Geiger guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, sorrow, and continued tension. For the Jean family, the conviction represented a measure of justice, though no verdict could restore their son to them. The conviction was significant in a broader context as well. Police officers are rarely convicted of murder in on-duty or off-duty shootings, and this case became part of the ongoing national dialogue about law enforcement accountability. The following day, the sentencing phase brought a series of wrenching victim impact statements. Botham's parents spoke with profound grief about the son they had lost, painting a picture of a young man whose potential had barely begun to unfold. The prosecution requested a sentence of at least 28 years, the age Botham would have reached that very Sunday. The defense highlighted Geiger's service as a police officer and characterized the shooting as an unprecedented tragedy rather than a premeditated act. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes before returning with a sentence of 10 years in prison. Silence filled the courtroom as the judge announced the decision. The Jean family sat in stunned disbelief, and the prosecution team appeared equally surprised by what many considered a lenient sentence. Under Texas law, Geiger would be eligible for parole in 5 years. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered to express their outrage at what they perceived as insufficient punishment for taking a life. Aubrey Hooper, president of the local NAACP chapter, stated that while the organization found the sentence inadequate, they hoped the conviction itself might offer some measure of comfort to Jean's family. What happened next stunned everyone present in the courtroom and soon captivated people around the world. Brant Jean, Botham's 18-year-old younger brother, asked the judge for permission to address Amber Geiger directly. With the court's consent, he walked across the courtroom and stood before the woman who had killed his brother. "I forgive you," he told her simply. "I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you, because I know that's exactly what Botham would want." Then, in a gesture that would be replayed countless times in news coverage worldwide, Brant asked if he could hug her. The judge permitted it, and the young man embraced his brother's killer tightly for nearly a minute. "I love you as a person, and I don't wish anything bad on you," he assured Geiger, who sobbed in his arms. The courtroom witnessed an extraordinary moment of grace and forgiveness that seemed to transcend the pain and anger that had saturated the trial. Brant would later explain that his journey to forgiveness had been neither simple nor immediate. In the year following his brother's death, he admitted that he had pretty much hated her, and had even discussed with friends his desire to harm Geiger. But during the trial, when he heard her express genuine remorse, something shifted in his heart. "I needed to hear it just once," he reflected, "and that's when my heart began to open." His act of forgiveness brought him recognition from strangers, many sharing their own stories of forgiveness and commending his courage. The legal proceedings, however, did not end with the sentencing. Geiger's attorneys filed an appeal, arguing that her mistaken belief about her location should reduce her culpability. They sought either a new trial or a reduction of her conviction to criminally negligent homicide, which carried a maximum sentence of only 2 years. The Fifth Court of Appeals heard arguments in April 2021. Dallas County Assistant District Attorney Douglas Gladden countered that a mistaken belief could not excuse murder, emphasizing that Geiger knew Jean was a living human being when she pointed her weapon at him. In August 2021, the appeals court unanimously upheld Geiger's conviction. The judges acknowledged that the facts of the case were not in dispute and recognized that Geiger had indeed entered Jean's apartment by mistake. However, they concluded that the jury could reasonably determine that Geiger's belief that deadly force was necessary was not reasonable under the circumstances. The court noted that her misunderstanding of Jean's status, as a resident of his own apartment rather than a burglar in hers, did not alter her mental state from intentional to criminally negligent. Geiger's conviction stood, with eligibility for parole beginning in 2024. The Jean family pursued justice through civil proceedings as well. In November 2024, a federal jury awarded them $9 million in damages. The jury found that Geiger had been acting in her capacity as a police officer when she shot Jean and had violated his constitutional rights by unreasonably using deadly force. The award included $10.25 million to Jean's estate for his pain, loss of life, and lost earnings, $14.2 million each to his mother and father for their loss and mental anguish, and $60 million in punitive damages against Geiger. The verdict represented not just financial compensation, but a formal acknowledgement that Botham Jean's constitutional rights had been violated when he was killed in his own home. 6 years after that September evening, Botham Jean's legacy endures through the memories of those who loved him, and through the broader conversations his death has prompted about justice, accountability, and the value of Black lives in America. PricewaterhouseCoopers honored their former colleague with a portrait in their new Dallas office, ensuring that his bright smile and promising future would be remembered. His family continues to speak his name and share his story, determined that he be remembered not as a victim defined by how he died, but as a vibrant young man defined by how he lived. The case of Amber Geiger and Botham Jean encompasses profound questions about responsibility, perception, and the split-second decisions that can irrevocably alter lives. It challenges us to consider how exhaustion, fear, and unconscious bias can converge into tragedy, and it asks whether legal systems designed to protect all citizens can truly deliver equal justice. Most powerfully, through Brant Jean's extraordinary act of forgiveness, it offers a glimpse of a grace that transcends our deepest wounds, even as it reminds us that forgiveness does not erase the need for accountability. Botham Jean deserved to finish his ice cream, to go to work the next morning, to sing in church that Sunday, and to live out the fullness of his days. That he did not remains an irreversible tragedy, a life extinguished in the place where he should have been safest, at home. Story 6. The September evening air hung heavy over Tecumseh, Michigan, carrying with it the last whispers of summer warmth as Friday the 14th arrived in 2018. In a modest home on North Maumee Street, a tragedy was about to unfold that would shatter 2 families and expose the dark secrets hiding beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary American household. Amy Allen was 34 years old, a quiet woman with a gentle demeanor who had moved to this small Michigan town just a year earlier with her husband James, who preferred to go by Jimmy, and their teenage daughter Ashley. Those who knew Amy described her as shy and reserved, someone who seemed to retreat into herself rather than command attention in a room. She had been a stay-at-home mother and wife for years, dedicated to caring for her family while her husband worked as a video production specialist for an automotive accessories company in nearby Ann Arbor. The family had relocated from Ocala, Florida, where Amy had deep roots and close connections to her mother Jean Winchester and the rest of her family. The move to Michigan had been difficult for Amy, pulling her away from the support system she had known all her life and dropping her into an unfamiliar landscape where the approaching winters felt as cold and isolating as her new existence. That Friday evening began like many others, with a decision that seemed innocuous at the time. Jimmy and Amy dropped their 15-year-old daughter Ashley at the Tecumseh High School football game before heading out to grab dinner and drinks together. They started at Ember's Bar and Grill before moving on to JR's Hometown Grill and Pub, two local establishments where the couple could sit together and perhaps bridge the growing distance that seemed to separate them. But the evening did not unfold as a romantic reconnection between husband and wife. Instead, tension crackled between them like electricity before a storm. Jimmy had been talking about selling their Michigan home and moving again, possibly to North Carolina, uprooting their lives once more after barely settling into Tecumseh. When he broached the subject with Amy at the bar, her response was pointed and cold, revealing the fractures in their relationship. She told him plainly that she hoped his plan worked out for him, the implication clear that she had no intention of following him on yet another relocation. The argument that began in the bar continued to simmer as the evening wore on, two people sitting across from each other, but existing in completely separate worlds. What Jimmy did not know was that Amy had been carrying her own secret, one that represented an escape from the confines of her carefully controlled life. For 3 years, she had been engaged in an online relationship with a man named George who lived on the East Coast. Their connection had begun as messages exchanged across digital space, but had evolved into something deeper and more significant. They had met in person on a couple of occasions, and George represented to Amy a version of herself that felt alive and valued. When she communicated with George, she transformed into a completely different person, positive and engaged rather than withdrawn and quiet. Even that evening at the bar, while sitting across from her husband during what would be their final argument, Amy had been texting with George, maintaining that secret connection that offered her something Jimmy no longer provided. The couple left the bar just before 8 o'clock in the evening, but they did not leave together. Jimmy got into his car and drove the short distance home, while Amy chose to walk, perhaps needing the cool evening air and the solitude of the journey to clear her head from the tension of the evening. A security camera captured her image at 7:51 that evening, walking alone down the street toward the house on North Maumee Street. She would arrive home shortly after, stepping through the door and into the last moments of her life. According to Jimmy's later account to police, he arrived home first and turned on the television at 8 o'clock. Amy came in shortly after and went down to the basement, an unfinished space beneath their house where the family kept various items and where their cat often wandered. When Jimmy went to check on why she had gone downstairs, he said she was petting the cat, and that was when she began swearing at him, the argument from the bar reigniting in the confined space of their home. Less than 40 minutes after Amy had walked through the front door, Jimmy would dial 911 in what he claimed was a desperate response to a horrifying discovery. The emergency call came through at 8:39 that evening, Jimmy's voice frantic as he told the dispatcher that his wife had tried to kill herself and was in the basement. He reported finding Amy hanging from an extension cord attached to a hook in the basement ceiling, her body suspended in what he insisted was a suicide attempt. Jimmy told the dispatcher he was performing CPR, trying desperately to revive his unresponsive wife as he waited for help to arrive. When first responders rushed into that basement, they found a scene that immediately triggered their professional instincts and raised troubling questions. Amy was still in the basement, the orange extension cord wrapped around her neck with a slip knot at one end and another knot tied where it would have been attached to a hook screwed into a joist in the low basement ceiling. But several details struck the paramedics and police officers as inconsistent with a typical hanging. The knots in the cord were not as tight as they would have expected from the weight of a body suspended in a hanging. The basement ceiling was extraordinarily low, raising questions about how Amy could have successfully hanged herself in such a confined space. Most troubling of all, there was little to no obvious trauma visible on Amy's neck, no deep ligature marks that would typically be expected when a cord had borne the full weight of a person's body during a hanging. The paramedics worked quickly, managing to restore a faint pulse despite Amy's dire condition. She was rushed to Pramadika Herrick Hospital in Tecumseh, where the emergency department staff continued their efforts to stabilize her. The doctors and nurses at Herrick shared the same concerns as the first responders, noting that the tightness of the knot around Amy's neck and the nature of her injuries did not seem consistent with a typical hanging suicide. Her condition was critical, and she was soon airlifted to the University of Michigan Hospital in Ann Arbor, where specialized care might offer her a chance at survival. But Amy never regained consciousness. She lay in the hospital for 3 days, her brain irreparably damaged from oxygen deprivation, while her family rushed to reach her bedside. What made the situation even more painful for Amy's loved ones was that they had not been immediately notified of her condition. Jimmy's father had informed them that Amy was already dead when in fact she was still on life support, clinging to life for nearly 14 hours before her family even knew what had happened. When Jean Winchester and the rest of Amy's family finally arrived at the hospital, they had only minutes to say their goodbyes before Amy was taken off life support and allowed to die. She passed away on September 17th, 3 days after that terrible evening in the basement, never having opened her eyes or spoken another word. The medical examiner's autopsy determined that Amy had died from asphyxiation, a finding that was not disputed. However, the manner of death was initially listed as undetermined pending further investigation, because the evidence did not clearly point to either suicide or homicide. Washtenaw County's medical examiner conducted the initial autopsy and noticed something significant. Amy had suffered a fracture to the tip of her thyroid cartilage in her neck. This type of injury could occur from pressure applied to the neck, but the actual cause of this specific fracture could not be definitively determined. A second forensic pathologist reviewed the case and concluded that Amy's death was likely a homicide, though he acknowledged it was a difficult determination to make given the complexities of the available information. The Tecumseh police began investigating Amy's death, conducting interviews and gathering evidence. After a month, they asked the Michigan State Police to take over the investigation, recognizing that the case required additional resources and expertise. Detectives began to piece together a more complete picture of Amy's life and her relationship with Jimmy, and what they discovered painted a troubling portrait of control and manipulation. Investigators learned that Jimmy had been extremely controlling throughout his marriage to Amy, a pattern that had intensified over the years. He had access to Amy's cell phone and monitored her communications, limiting her use of social media and even restricting how she spent her time, including playing video games. He kept close tabs on what his family ate and where they went, creating an environment where Amy had to check with him before making even simple decisions like going to lunch with her own mother. Jean Winchester would later reflect that she believed Jimmy had deliberately kept Amy from entering the workforce, wanting her to remain at home where he could maintain control over her life. Witnesses who knew the couple described Amy as someone who seemed to shrink into herself, quiet and withdrawn, living under the weight of her husband's domination. The evidence of Jimmy's controlling nature extended beyond his relationship with Amy. Amy's son from a previous relationship, Caleb Winchester, testified about a disturbing incident that had occurred when he was in high school. During an argument, Jimmy had become angry with Caleb and put the teenager in a chokehold, using his arm to compress Caleb's neck until the young man was restrained and subdued. The incident had been frightening enough that Caleb eventually moved out of the house to live with his maternal grandparents, choosing to remove himself from Jimmy's household rather than continue living under the same roof. Detectives also discovered that Jimmy had engaged in 2 extramarital affairs during his marriage to Amy, betrayals that added another layer of complexity to their relationship. While Jimmy had been stepping outside his marriage, Amy had sought connection elsewhere as well, finding in George an outlet for feelings and aspects of herself that she could not express in her controlled home life. The investigation revealed that Amy had even made plans to meet George in person the following month, in October 2018, a future meeting that would never take place. Her electronic communications showed a woman who was making plans for the future, thinking about vacations and holidays and meals to come, not someone on the verge of taking her own life. As the investigation progressed, detectives examined the physical evidence more closely. They brought in a materials scientist and chemist named Elizabeth Buck to test the extension cord that had been found around Amy's neck. Buck conducted experiments with similar cords, subjecting them to the weight that would be expected during a hanging. Her findings were significant. When subjected to Amy's weight of 140 pounds, the cords would either elongate or break entirely, and the knots at both the hook and the neck would have become extremely tight. Yet the cord found around Amy's neck had shown none of these characteristics, suggesting it had not actually borne the full weight of her body in a typical hanging scenario. 2 years after Amy's death, in 2020, the Lenawee County Prosecutor's Office filed an open murder charge against James David Allen. He was arrested in Ocala, Florida, where he had returned to live with his parents within a week of Amy's death, taking their daughter Ashley with him. Jimmy had been adamant from the beginning that he was innocent, insisting that Amy had tragically taken her own life and that he had nothing to do with her death. He had cooperated with police throughout their investigation, providing statements and evidence that he believed demonstrated his innocence. The trial began in September 2021, more than 3 years after that terrible evening in the basement. Over the course of almost 2 weeks, jurors heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, each contributing pieces to the puzzle of what had happened to Amy Allen. First responders described their suspicions when they arrived at the scene and found the inconsistencies in the physical evidence. Medical personnel from both Herrick Hospital and the University of Michigan Hospital testified about their observations and concerns. 3 different forensic pathologists took the stand, each offering their own interpretation of the evidence, and remarkably reaching different conclusions about whether Amy's death was a suicide or a homicide. The prosecution presented a theory of what had happened in that basement on September 14th. They argued that when Jimmy and Amy returned home from the bar, the argument that had started earlier in the evening had continued and escalated. Amy, perhaps emboldened by her secret relationship with George, or simply exhausted from years of control, had stood up for herself in a way that Jimmy was not accustomed to tolerating. In the basement of their home, the prosecutors theorized, Jimmy had approached Amy from behind and wrapped his arm around her neck in what is known as a rear naked choke hold, a technique that compresses the carotid arteries and can render a person unconscious within seconds. Once Amy had lost consciousness, Jimmy had then strangled her with the extension cord and staged the scene to make it appear that she had hanged herself, creating the appearance of a suicide to cover his actions. The defense mounted a vigorous challenge to this theory, arguing that Amy had indeed taken her own life. They emphasized that Amy had been drinking that evening and had a blood alcohol content of 0.09 when she arrived at Herrick Hospital, suggesting that alcohol might have impaired her judgment and contributed to a decision to attempt suicide. Defense attorneys highlighted that the initial medical examiner had been unable to definitively rule Amy's death a homicide, listing the manner of death as undetermined. They had planned to present testimony from Dr. Francisco Diaz, a highly respected forensic pathologist and chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, who had reviewed all the evidence and concluded that Amy's death was most consistent with a low suspension, hanging by suicide rather than a homicide. However, Dr. Diaz suffered a medical emergency the night before he was scheduled to testify and was hospitalized, unable to appear in court. Instead, his opinion letter was read to the jury, providing his expert assessment that the evidence pointed to suicide. Jimmy did not testify at his own trial, a decision that is every defendant's right, but one that always leaves questions hanging in the air. His daughter Ashley, who was 15 at the time of her mother's death, testified on behalf of her father, supporting his claim that Amy had taken her own life. The family dynamics were heartbreaking, with Ashley standing by her father, even as Amy's own family sat on the other side of the courtroom, convinced that Jimmy had murdered their beloved daughter and sister. The jury began their deliberations after attorneys finished their closing arguments, tasked with deciding whether Jimmy Allen was guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, second-degree murder, or not guilty. They deliberated for about an hour and a half on the first day before being sent home for the evening. The following day, after almost 6 hours of total deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom at approximately 2:20 in the afternoon on September 24, 2021. They had reached a verdict. James David Allen was guilty of second-degree murder in the death of his wife Amy. The conviction meant that the jury had found that Jimmy had intentionally killed Amy, but had not premeditated the murder, suggesting they believed he had acted in the heat of the moment during their argument rather than planning her death in advance. On October 21, 2021, Circuit Judge Michael R. Alsaver sentenced Jimmy Allen to 20 to 45 years in prison, a sentence that would allow for the possibility of parole but ensured he would spend decades behind bars. As the sentence was handed down, the two families sat in the courtroom with vastly different emotions washing over them. For Amy's mother, Jean Winchester, there was a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. She told reporters that it felt like they had finally gotten justice for Amy, that her daughter finally had a voice after being silenced in that basement. But she was also acutely aware that there were no true winners in this tragedy, that both families had been shattered beyond repair. Their family was broken, grieving the loss of Amy and the years they would never have with her. Jimmy's family was broken too, with a father in prison and a daughter who had lost both parents in one terrible evening. Jimmy Allen appealed his conviction, arguing that he had been denied effective assistance of counsel and that he should be granted a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. He maintained that Dr. Diaz's inability to testify in person had deprived him of his right to present a complete defense, and that additional testimony from Dr. Diaz about other possible causes of Amy's thyroid cartilage fracture constituted new evidence that could change the outcome. In April 2024, the Michigan Court of Appeals reviewed his arguments and affirmed his conviction, finding that his trial counsel had acted reasonably under difficult circumstances and that the evidence did not warrant a new trial. The case of Amy Allen remains a tragedy that touches everyone who learns about it. It is the story of a woman who seemed trapped in a life she could not escape, controlled by a husband who monitored her every move and dictated her existence. It is the story of secrets kept in the digital shadows, of an online relationship that offered Amy a glimpse of who she might have been in different circumstances. It is the story of an argument in a bar that escalated into violence, of a basement where a life ended and a family was destroyed. Most of all, it is a reminder that behind closed doors, in homes that look ordinary from the outside, people can be suffering in ways that remain invisible until it is too late. Amy's family continues to carry the weight of her loss, remembering the quiet, shy woman who deserved so much more than the life she was given and the death she suffered. They remember the daughter, the mother, the sister who was taken from them on that September evening in 2018. And they hold on to the knowledge that after years of investigation and a lengthy trial, a jury looked at the evidence and decided that Amy did not take her own life, that someone took it from her in an act of violence that he then tried to disguise as tragedy. In the end, justice may have been served with Jimmy Allen's conviction and imprisonment, but nothing can bring Amy back or restore what was lost on that autumn night in Tecumseh, Michigan. Her story stands as a testament to the importance of seeing the signs of control and abuse before they escalate into violence, and to the courage it takes to break free from relationships that suffocate rather than sustain. Story 7. The sun had barely crested the horizon on June 7, 1998, when the quiet town of Jasper, Texas, awoke to a horror that would sear itself into the nation's conscience. A motorist, driving along Huff Creek Road, slowed his pickup truck, his eyes catching on something unnatural strewn across the asphalt. At first, he thought it might be debris from a hit and run, perhaps an animal struck by a careless driver. But as he pulled over and stepped closer, the truth clawed its way into his mind, sharp and sickening. Scattered along the road were pieces of a human body, torn flesh, a severed arm, a head. The remains were so mangled that it was hard to believe they had once belonged to a living person. The motorist stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, and fumbled for his phone to call the police. What he had stumbled upon was no accident. It was the aftermath of a crime so brutal, so steeped in hatred, that it would shake Jasper to its core and send ripples across the world. This was the murder of James Byrd Jr., and among the three men responsible was Sean Allen Barry, a name that would become synonymous with one of the most infamous hate crimes in American history. Jasper, a small town of about 7,000 nestled in the piney woods of East Texas, was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where life moved at a steady, unhurried pace. It was a community of modest homes, churches on every corner, and a history that, like much of the South, carried the weight of racial tensions not fully resolved. By 1998, Jasper had made strides toward integration, but beneath the surface, old prejudices lingered, quiet but persistent. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old African-American man, was a familiar face in town. Known for his warm smile and easygoing nature, he was a father, a musician, and a man who, despite his struggles with alcoholism, was loved by those who knew him. He had grown up in Jasper, raised his 3 children there, and spent his evenings playing the guitar or singing at local gatherings. His life was not without hardship. He had been in and out of trouble for minor offenses, and his disability checks barely kept him afloat, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity, a man who found joy in small moments. On the night of June 6, 1998, James Byrd Jr. was walking home from a family gathering. The air was warm, thick with the scent of pine and the hum of cicadas. He had been drinking, his steps a little unsteady, but he was in good spirits, his mind likely on the music he'd played earlier or the laughter of his family. He was on a familiar stretch of road, not far from home, when a gray Ford pickup truck slowed beside him. Inside were 3 young white men, Sean Allen Barry, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and John William King. To James, they might have seemed like just another group of locals offering a ride. He accepted, climbing into the truck bed, unaware that this decision would lead to his final, agonizing moments. Sean Barry, then 23, was the driver that night. He was a Jasper native, a wiry young man with a boyish face and a reputation for being likable, if a bit aimless. He worked odd jobs, managing a local theater and doing occasional construction work, but his life was marked by a lack of direction. Unlike his companions, Barry did not have an extensive criminal record, though he had been arrested for minor offenses like theft and drug possession. To those who knew him, he was the least likely of the trio to be involved in something as heinous as what was about to unfold. But that night, Barry's choices would bind him to a crime that would define his life. Lawrence Brewer, 31, was a different story. A hardened criminal with a history of drug possession and burglary, Brewer had spent much of his adult life in and out of prison. His most recent stint had been at the Beto Unit, a Texas prison where he had joined a white supremacist gang, the Confederate Knights of America. Brewer's body was a canvas of hate, tattooed with swastikas and other symbols of white supremacy. His worldview was steeped in the toxic ideology he had embraced behind bars, a belief in racial superiority that had festered over years of incarceration. Brewer was not a Jasper native. He had drifted into town after his parole, living with Barry in a small apartment and bringing with him a darkness that would soon spill over. John King, 23, was the third man in the truck and perhaps the most dangerous. Like Brewer, King had been shaped by the prison system, where he too had joined a white supremacist gang. His body bore the marks of his ideology, tattoos of a lynching, a burning cross, and the words Aryan pride. King was a volatile figure, charismatic in a twisted way, with a penchant for quoting the Turner Diaries, a white supremacist manifesto that glorified racial violence. He had grown up in Jasper, but his time in prison had hardened him, turning him into a man who saw the world through a lens of hatred. King was the ringleader, the one whose venomous ideas would drive the events of that night. As the truck rolled down the road with James Byrd Jr. in the bed, the mood inside the cab was tense, charged with a reckless energy. The men had been drinking, their inhibitions lowered, their prejudices sharpened. According to later testimony, it was King who first suggested they have some fun with the man in the back. What began as a seemingly innocuous offer of a ride quickly turned sinister. Instead of taking Bird home, Barry drove the truck down a secluded logging road, a place where the dense forest swallowed sound and light. There, in the darkness, the three men pulled Bird from the truck bed. What happened next was a descent into unimaginable cruelty. The attack began with a beating. Brewer and King, fueled by alcohol and their shared ideology, unleashed a barrage of punches and kicks on Bird. He fought back, his cries echoing in the night, but he was no match for the three men. They beat him until he was bloodied and barely conscious, his body slumped against the ground. But the violence didn't stop there. In a chilling escalation, King suggested they take it further. They chained Bird's ankles to the back of the truck with a heavy logging chain, the metal biting into his skin. Barry, behind the wheel, started the engine. What followed was a 3-mile journey of torment, as Bird was dragged behind the truck along the rough asphalt of Huff Creek Road. His body was torn apart by the road, his screams eventually silenced as his life was ripped away. Halfway through the dragging, his head and right arm were severed when his body struck a culvert. The men continued, oblivious or indifferent to the horror they were inflicting, until they finally stopped near an African-American church, dumping what remained of Bird's body in a ditch. The next morning, as the motorist's call brought police to the scene, Jasper's small law enforcement team was overwhelmed by the scale of the crime. Sheriff Billy Rolls, a gruff but compassionate man who had served Jasper for years, arrived at Huff Creek Road and stood frozen, his years of experience doing little to prepare him for the sight before him. The crime scene stretched over 3 miles, a trail of blood, flesh, and bone marking the path of Bird's final moments. Investigators found pieces of evidence scattered along the road, a wrench with Barry etched into it, a lighter inscribed with Possum, King's prison nickname, and cigarette butts that would later be tied to the three men. The sheer brutality of the crime pointed to something deeper than a random act of violence. Within hours, the FBI was called in, and the case was classified as a hate crime, a determination driven by the racial dynamics and the white supremacist affiliations of Brewer and King. As news of the murder spread, Jasper became a town under siege, not by violence, but by grief, fear, and the weight of national attention. The African-American community, already wary of lingering racism, gathered at the church where Bird's body had been dumped, holding vigils and demanding justice. White residents, many of whom had lived alongside black neighbors for years, were forced to confront the ugliness that had erupted in their midst. The media descended, with reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN setting up camp in Jasper's modest downtown. The story of James Byrd Jr.'s murder became a national symbol of racial hatred, a stark reminder that the ghosts of America's past were far from exorcised. The investigation moved quickly. By June 8th, police had identified Barry, Brewer, and King as suspects, thanks to the physical evidence and tips from locals who had seen the trio together that night. Barry was the first to be arrested, picked up at his apartment where he lived with Brewer. He was pale and shaken, his boyish demeanor crumbling under the weight of what he had done. Brewer and King were apprehended soon after, their defiance starkly different from Barry's apparent remorse. In police interviews, Barry claimed he had been a bystander, that he had tried to stop the others but was overpowered by their will. Brewer and King, however, showed no such contrition. King, in particular, was unapologetic, reportedly referencing the Turner Diaries and even scrawling Sieg Heil in a letter from jail. Their white supremacist beliefs were laid bare, with court documents later revealing their ties to prison gangs and their pride in the tattoos that marked their allegiance to hate. The legal process was swift but meticulous. By early 1999, the three men were charged with capital murder, the highest felony level in Texas, carrying the possibility of the death penalty. Jasper County District Attorney Guy James Gray, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for fairness, took on the case with a heavy heart. He knew the eyes of the nation were on Jasper, and he was determined to deliver justice without letting the case become a circus. The trials were separated to ensure fairness. with Berry set to begin first in February 1999. Sean Berry's trial was a tense affair, held in the Jasper County Courthouse, a squat brick building that had seen its share of local dramas, but nothing like this. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, community members, and Bird's family filling the pews. Luvon Harris, James's sister, sat in the front row, her face a mask of grief and resolve. She had lost her brother in the most horrific way imaginable, and now she was here to bear witness, to ensure his death would not be in vain. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case, presenting the physical evidence, the wrench, the lighter, the chain, and calling witnesses who placed Berry at the scene. A key piece of testimony came from a forensic pathologist, who described in harrowing detail the injuries Bird had suffered, confirming that he was alive and conscious for much of the dragging, his body torn apart while he fought to survive. Berry's defense team, led by a local attorney, argued that he was not the mastermind, that he had been swept up in the actions of Brewer and King, men whose hatred ran deeper and whose influence was stronger. Berry took the stand, his voice trembling as he recounted the night, claiming he had only driven the truck and had not participated in the beating or the decision to chain Bird. He said he was afraid of Brewer and King, that their white supremacist rhetoric had intimidated him into compliance. But the prosecution was unrelenting, pointing out that Berry had driven the truck, that he had made no effort to stop the crime or alert authorities afterward. They painted a picture of a young man who, while perhaps not as ideologically driven as his companions, had made a choice to participate in an act of unimaginable cruelty. The jury, a mix of black and white Jasper residents, deliberated for just a few hours before reaching a verdict. On February 25, 1999, Sean Berry was found guilty of capital murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, arguing that Berry's role, while perhaps less ideologically motivated, was no less culpable. But Berry's cooperation with police, providing details of the crime and expressing remorse, swayed the jury. They sentenced him to life in prison without parole until 2038, sparing him the death penalty. As the gavel fell, Luvon Harris wept quietly, her relief tempered by the knowledge that no sentence could bring her brother back. Brewer and King's trials followed, each a grim echo of Berry's. Brewer's trial, in August 1999, revealed the depth of his hatred, with prosecutors presenting evidence of his white supremacist affiliations and his lack of remorse. The jury sentenced him to death, a decision that brought a measure of closure to Bird's family, but did little to ease their pain. King's trial, in November 1999, was the most contentious. His unapologetic demeanor and the stark evidence of his leadership in the crime, his tattoos, his writings, his boasts, made the case against him airtight. The jury sentenced him to death as well, a verdict that resonated as a rebuke to the hatred he embodied. Brewer was executed in 2011, King in 2019, their deaths closing a chapter but leaving scars that would never fully heal. The James Byrd Jr. case was more than a crime. It was a reckoning. In Jasper, it forced the community to confront its divisions, to ask how such hatred could fester in a place that prided itself on neighborly values. Nationally, it sparked a renewed conversation about race, hate crimes, and the legacy of violence in America. In 2001, Texas passed the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act, strengthening penalties for crimes motivated by bias. In 2009, the federal government followed with the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, a landmark law that expanded protections against hate crimes. These legislative victories were bittersweet for Bird's family, who continued to honor his memory through the Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing, led by Luvon Harris. The foundation worked to combat racism, to ensure that James's death would not be forgotten, that his life would inspire change. For Sean Berry, life in prison was a stark contrast to the freedom he once knew. As of 2020, he was housed in protective custody at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Ramsey Unit, confined to an 8 by 6-foot cell for 23 hours a day. His days were marked by routine, his world reduced to the bare essentials of existence. He married by proxy, a small gesture toward connection in a life defined by isolation. His parole eligibility in 2038 looms as a distant possibility, one that Bird's family, particularly Lou Von Harris, remains vigilant about, determined to ensure he serves his full sentence. In Jasper, the wounds of 1998 have not fully healed. The town has worked to move forward, with community leaders fostering dialogue and reconciliation. But the memory of James Byrd Jr. lingers, a reminder of both the capacity for cruelty and the resilience of those who seek justice. His grave, now protected by an iron railing after acts of vandalism, stands as a quiet testament to a man whose life was taken, but whose legacy endures. The story of his murder, and of Sean Berry's role in it, is a chapter in America's ongoing struggle with its past, a narrative of pain, redemption, and the hope that from tragedy, change can rise.